All right, we're in the sixth parak of Yevamot, which is full of Agadata. Right now we're on Daf Samach Gimel Amud Aleph, and we'll be dealing with the series of passages that deal with the question of farming versus business in terms of what is preferable, what is more admirable, what type of profession should people go into. We'll look at the Gemara, and actually it also has some kind of common wisdom, some proverbs, some which are kind of interesting. But we'll focus on what's motivating the Gemara behind its statements around the potential pros and cons of farming and why they have the perspective that they do. And we'll see also that there's different opinions within the Midrashim and within the Mefarshim about how to interpret that. So let's get started. So the Gemara in Yevamot Daf Samach Gimel Amud Aleph teaches as follows. It says, Amar Rabbi Elazar, Atidim kol ba'alei umaniyot she'amdu ala karka. So in the future, as the end of days, all other professions will, or all other professionals will leave their careers, their professions, and they'll go into farming. They'll go into working the land. Shneimar, and he quotes a pasuk from Yechezkel, V'yardu ma'aniyotihem, kol tofsei mashot, melachim, kol chovlei hayam, al haaretz ya'amodu. So there it says all the people will get off their boats, anyone who has anyone who works with oars, or any sailors, or anyone who goes out to sea. And they're all going to come, they're going to go down from their boats and come stand on the land. So somehow Rabbi Elazar learns from that, A, that it's a reference to the Atid, at the end of days, and B, that it means that all professions will end up leaving what they do, and they'll go and become, work in agriculture. But then he continues and says, "V'amar Rabbi Elazar, ein lecha umanut pchuta min hakarka, shneimar v'yardu." Right, so he says, but it says v'yardu maniyotihim. They'll come down from their boats. And so whenever we talk about things being yirida, going down, it means something lesser, not just physically going down. So he says that there's no field that is lower than working the land. Right, it's the basest, most lowest form of work. So we see here two statements that don't necessarily seem to go hand in hand. Right, one is where he says that in the Yemot Mashiach, or in the future, right, everyone's gonna drop whatever they're doing and become farmers. But on the other hand, farming is it's the lowest profession there is. So how do we put those two together? We'll get back to that at the end. That's what the Mefarshim will deal with. Let's continue. So Rabbi Elazar chazia leahi ara deshadi be karba leputia. So this means Rabbi Elazar saw that there was a plot of land that it was plowed widthwise. It was plowed along its width. Amar le, he said to it, and he says to the land, right, you're plowed by your width, but even if they plowed you by your length, in order to improve your gains and get more out of you, so even if you're plowed in both directions, working in business would still be better than you. In other words, anyone who goes into business it's still better than if they plowed you lengthwise, let alone the fact they're only plowed widthwise. Similarly, Rav alibine shibale chaznehu dekan niafan. So Rav one time was walking through this wheat field, and he saw that the stalks of wheat were swaying in the wind. So Amar lahu, he said to the stalks of wheat, or to the stalks, I niafet into itnufe hafuche biska tav minach. So he said to the stalks, you can sway all you want, continue to sway to your heart's content, but doing business is still always going to be better than you. In other words, these are statements of these rabbis. Rabbi Elazar, again, is consistent with what he said, that there's nothing lower than working the land, but saying, that working in commerce or in business is preferential or better or more profitable than working the land. The Gemara continues. Amar Rava, mea zuzei بعיסקא, kol yomא bשרא וחמרא. Okay, so 100 zuz of business. If you have that, then every day you'll eat wine. You'll get to eat meat, like nice meats and wine. If you have that in business, then you'll live a good life. Mea zuzei בארעא, מילחא וחפורה. But the same amount of zuzei Ba'ara that you invest in your agriculture, So it just leads to basically eating salt and dirt. That you don't get nearly the same returns that you would in business. And not only that, but if you work the land, then you have to guard your land, right? You have to be magen on it because, things might happen to it. You always have to be on guard and stressed out about guarding it. And you also get into all sorts of fights and arguments with other landowners about land disputes and all sorts of other things. So it's not just that the returns are much lower, but also it's a much more stressful mode of living, a much more stressful profession than working in business. So there are a bunch of statements that are pretty harsh on agriculture or working the land as a profession. This isn't related to agriculture, but I did just want to bring these last few lines just because I thought they were pretty interesting, because these are more like proverbs or just words of wisdom from the rabbis. So Amar Rav Papa Azra v'lo tazbin afal gav d'chi hadadi ninhu hani mevarchan. So that means you should grow your own food and you shouldn't go and buy it from the store, because even if the value is the same, in other words, even if the amount of money you have to spend plus your time to make it yourself is equal to going and buying it from the store, it's more blessed to eat the food that you yourself have prepared. It's better than going and buying it. He says, however, zabin velo tizol. But it's the opposite is true when it comes to your clothes. That when it comes to your clothes, you should buy them and you shouldn't sew them yourselves. You shouldn't make your own clothes. Then the Gemara says, but hani mile bistirke aval glima lo. So that's only true when it comes to certain types of mattresses, but when it comes to your coats or your cloaks, that's not the case, because you may want it tailored and you may have very specific things about how you want your coat to look. So when it comes to your coat, then maybe you should prepare it yourself versus just buy it store-bought. Okay? And it continues, and it says, Mitramya le'tum velo tashpitz, shaputz velo tibnei, shekol ha'osek b'minyan, mit masken. Fine, this is relevant to you. It says, if there's a hole in your wall, or there's damage to the wall of your house, so you should fill it up with plaster, and you shouldn't do shiputzim. Or if you're going to do shiputzim, then at least do simple shiputzim and don't go and build a whole new thing. Right, minimum, if you have some little damage, so then just patch it up. Don't go and do a whole new building project to fix it. Because anybody who, anyone who goes and deals with building things, mit masken, he's going to be misken. He's going to go and lose all his money, and it's going to be a whole to-do, and it's going to be bad news for him. And then the Gemara continues and says, kfot zabin ara. But on the other hand, you should jump to buy land. In other words, this is also something that's applicable to me and Frank can relate to that. You should jump at the opportunity to buy property because you don't know if you'll miss your opportunity. So jump to buy land when you can. And then it concludes and says, Meton nesiv itita, nachit darga nesiv itita, sak darga b'chad shushbina. Which basically means, you should go up a level when you're looking for a shushbina, which is a friend. When you're choosing a friend, go up a social level, pick friends that are higher up than you. But when it comes to choosing a wife or a life partner, then you should not go up a level, you should go down a level. Because if you marry someone who's from a higher social status, then you won't have a happy marriage because for obvious reasons. So that's Ad Kan the Gemara. It has all these kind of random little nice words to live your life by. But as I said in the beginning, I'd like to dwell on the first two statements by Rabbi Elazar about, on the one hand, in the future, everyone wants to be farmers, on the other hand, it's the worst profession today. So how do we resolve the tension between those two ideas?
Ron, just a quick, in Gracious, you see that the working the land that's the curse of Adam, that he's going to work the land, and it's going to be however, I forgot the exact terminology, but it's going to be thorns and thickets. You're not going to have any pleasure from all your hard work. So it seems already like in Bereshit, the Torah is setting like the idea that agriculture, working the land, is not an easy profession.
Sure. Yeah. Absolutely. There's a few things to say about that. That's a good point. You could argue that is just in general, right? Adam is cursed with having to work, and it uses the metaphor of, not the metaphor, but saying, if you go, you're going to have to work hard. That just means in contrast to Gan Eden, where everything's handed to you on a silver platter. So, even if you're in business, you still have to work harder than if you didn't have to work at all. But yeah, I think, your point is definitely true that the land is cursed, and I think we see it with Cain and Hevel, that Hevel was an Oved Adamah, and Cain was an Oved Adamah, and Hevel was a shepherd. Certainly, the Torah as well seems to acknowledge that kind of the agriculture is more intensive and lower in a sense than other professions. So it's a good point. And we'll actually see how perhaps the conclusion of what we're going to say would maybe turn that idea on its head a little bit. Going back to what you said about the Torah and how it relates to certain professions, so I didn't actually bring it here, but there is a Gemara that, like, if you think shepherding, for example, right? So all the examples in the Torah of shepherding is positive ones. Right? All the leaders were shepherds. And that's the Ishpizin, or the 7 shepherds. Like all the great figures in the Torah were Ro'ei Tzon. But actually, if you think, okay, the rabbis would have a positive outlook on Ro'ei Tzon. But the truth is that Ro'ei Tzon, there's Gemaras that talk about how shepherds are that they're prohibited to be witnesses in court, that they're disqualified from testimony. And the reason is that they're assumed to be robbers, and robbers are disqualified from testimony. So why are they assumed to be robbers? Because shepherds let their sheep go and graze on fields, and they don't necessarily, that they're not too makpid on making sure that they're not stealing from other people's land. The sheep goes and grazes somewhere, so they go and graze somewhere. The shepherds are not the most upstanding citizens in the eyes of the Talmud. So kind of the question I'd like to pose based on that, in one that will kind of maybe inform the discussion now, is there's kind of 2 ways of addressing a profession in terms of whether it's good or bad, right? One is to say the actual field itself is something good or bad. The other is to kind of say, irrespective of what the field itself represents, the people who happen to work in that field are good or bad, right? So like taking the example of the shepherds, so I think when the Talmud says, that shepherds are disqualified from testimony and that we assume that they're gazlanim, so it's not saying that shepherding is a bad profession, right? Because of course the opposite, it's the good profession for spirituality and contemplation and all the reasons, all the classical reasons that we attribute Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, etc. to being shepherds. But in the times of the Talmud, it happened to be that people who were shepherds were bums, right? That they weren't going out into the field to contemplate, and it could be abused, and the types of people that were shepherds were more on the negative side. So, perhaps the question with agriculture could be raised as well, is the statements that we saw seem to be attacking the field. Are they attacking the field of working the land, or are they attacking the types of people that work the land? So from the statements that we saw so far, it seems that there's something about actually working the land that is a negative thing, right? Obviously, all the practical statements we saw about how, just in the sense of, if you go into business, it'll just be more profitable, it's much easier. So then that's something about working the land itself, that the margins are much lower. But what about Rabbi Elazar's statements, where he says that people are going to want to be farmers, and that farming is the lowest type of profession for a person? So, let's look at a few Gemaras and Midrashim. So the Gemara in Sanhedrin on Daf Nun Chet Amud Bet says as follows: Amar Rabbi Elazar, Lo nitna karka ela leba'alei zruot, shneimar ve'ish zruah lo haaretz. Which basically just means that working the land was given to Ba'alei Zurot, which I think means, strong men, like people who are physically in shape. The Amar Reish Lakish said, "Ma'ay dichtiv oved admato yizba lechem, im oseh adam atzmo ke'eved la'adama yizba lechem, ve'im lav lo yizba lechem." So this is very interesting, because Reish Lakish says, we have a pasuk that says, someone who works the land, his land will have bread. Right? It's a pasuk in Mishlei. So the simple understanding of that pasuk is that whoever works his land will be satiated. It's a statement about work ethic and working hard, and it's Mishlei coming and saying, whoever works his land will then end up reaping the benefits of it and have what to eat, right? And anyone who doesn't work will not have the benefits to eat. It's just saying that you should work hard in order to make a living. But the way Reish Lakish interprets it is that Oved admato, not Oved to work the land, but Eved, slave. Anyone who is a slave to his land will have bread, but anybody who does not make himself a slave to his land will not have bread. In other words, he's using this as an opportunity to say that anyone who works his land is a slave to his land. That there's no way to work your land and still be able to be Zbalechem and survive and have bread unless you literally enslave yourself to your land. It's a profession that, as we saw in the Gemara in Yevamot, that you have to kind of guard it at all times and you're constantly worrying about it. It's something that is an all-consuming profession to the point where you become a slave to it. So the connotation there is also quite negative. But we'll see now that there's other statements that seem to have a different approach or take on the value of working the land. So one is the Gemara in Shabbat of Lamed Aleph Amud Aleph, where it says as follows: Amar Reish Lakish. So it's also Reish Lakish, interestingly. He says, "Mai dichtiv vaya emunat itecha chosen yishuot chochmat vadat." So emunat ze seder zraim, itecha ze seder moed, chosen ze seder nashim, yishuot ze seder nezikin, chochmat ze seder kodshim, vadat ze seder taorot, vafilu achi yirat Hashem yotzaro. In other words, there's shisha sidrei Mishnah. Right? There's 6 categories in the Mishnah. Zraim, moed, nashim, nezikin, kodshim, and taorot. The 6 categories, and Reish Lakish interprets this pasuk from Yeshayahu that each word in the pasuk refers to a different seder of the Torah Shebaal Peh. And based on that mapping that he makes, the first word, Seder Zraim, is the first one. Right? Seder Zraim is all the laws about agriculture. And the first word that's mapped, emunat. So emunah is a Seder Zraim. So, the next one, for example, is itecha, your times, is Seder Moed. So obviously everything having to do with Seder Moed is about the Chagim and Shabbat, so it makes sense to say your times has to do with that. But what does emunah have to do with Seder Zraim? So Tosfot says, emunah is Seder Zraim, mefaresh b'Yerushalmi, shema'amin b'chai ha'olamim v'zoreah. Because to be a person who is zoreah, right, to be in the field of agriculture, you have to be ma'amin b'chai ha'olamim. It's the type of profession that you don't know where your next meal is going to come from because it's the lowest of the fields and it's so filled with stress and it's such a low, you don't make a lot of money compared to other professions. So in a way that leads you to have emunah, right? You need to have faith in order to survive being a farmer because it's so volatile and it's so uncertain about what your crops will yield, etc., etc. And so that's obviously seen in a positive light in the sense that even they're not. In other words, this Reish Lakish doesn't contradict the one we saw above in Sanhedrin, right? Above he said you have to make yourself a slave to your land. And we said that has a negative connotation, obviously, because it means you have to kind of give your life over to what your work. But here he's saying, but that also leads you to have emunah, which you might not have in other professions, just because you have to live, paycheck to paycheck, as it were. The Sifra actually... yeah, go ahead.
I read that slightly differently. That working the land should give you an appreciation of Hashem's rule and hashpa'ah on the world, right? So it's less kind of, oh, I don't know where my next meal's coming from, therefore I have faith I'm going to get the meal. But, us who kind of, we don't see that process of farm to table, so to speak, whereas they who do could really appreciate, Hashem's control of the world and therefore actually have greater emunah than us.
I like that a lot. That's not how I understood it, but now that you say that seems, I like that better than what I said. That makes a lot of sense. in the sense of kind of, if like people who work in business, so it's all human transactions, right? It's money going from one hand to the other. It's all business, so you don't have something that comes from God in as direct a way, right? Versus if you're out in nature, you're actually plowing the land and harvesting, so then that's right. You're more connected to kind of an appreciation of God. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Yeah. Fair enough. Thank you. Okay, let's go on to the next midrash, the Sifra and Parshat Behar. So Behar, among other things, talks about a Jew who is down on his luck. He has to sell himself into slavery. So we're told, the Sifra is halachic midrash. So it says, Minayin she'ein adam rashai limkor et sadeu velaniach ba'afudato velikach lo behema velikach lo kelim velikach lo bait ela im ken ha'ani. So how do we know that a person is not allowed to go and kind of give up his field? In other words, if he's a farmer, give up his field and leave it behind, and then go into business, as it were, right? Go buy maybe an animal, go buy a house, go buy like utensils and clothes, unless he has become poor. In other words, unless he has no other option in order to survive. That is the only. How do we know that that's the only valid reason why a person's allowed to leave his farming? Talmud lomar ki amuch achicha u'machar, right? That a person will become poor and he will sell. So that means ha'ena mocher ela im ken he'ani. In other words, the way the Torah describes the situation of someone who sells himself into slavery is that he didn't have any money. So that means that you can't do it unless you're poor. And then it continues. So perhaps, and this I think is maybe a bit far-fetched of a reading, so maybe Johnny has a better way to understand this, but perhaps one way to understand that is to kind of a similar theme of a person is almost not allowed to leave farming unless he really can't make ends meet. And even if he has to struggle, he still is supposed to persevere and not sell himself into slavery, as it were. And again, perhaps the reasons are that the reason could be is that even though it's a harder lifestyle, it comes with certain quote-unquote benefits in terms of a person's relationship with God and appreciation for things and not taking things for granted, etc. So that's one way perhaps to read that. I think maybe the strongest source for this concept is actually in Bereshit Rabbah in Perek Lametet, which talks about Avram Avinu. So we're never told why. Right? Avram Avinu is introduced. Basically, he's introduced to us that God says to him, "I've chosen you. Go to Eretz Canaan. I've chosen you. I will bless you, etc., etc." But the Torah doesn't actually say what he did to merit blessing. Right? There's plenty of stories afterwards that showcase his righteousness, but there's nothing before. So the question that a lot of midrashim try to address is, why was Avram chosen in the first place to be the Av Hamon Goyim? So one explanation provided is by Rabbi Levi, and he says, "Amar Rabbi Levi, b'shah she'Avram me'alech be'aram naharaim u'be'aram nachor." So when he was kind of going in his home world, he was walking around. So he saw them eating, drinking, and being merry. In other words, being very materialistic. Amar, and then Avram said, "Halavai lo yeheli chelek ba'aretz hazot." Right? I hope I don't have a place in this land. V'kevan she'igia l'sulama shel Tzor, Tzor here is like Tyre, it's like Lebanon. When he got to the incline of Lebanon, which is the outskirts of Eretz Yisrael, Ra'a otan asukin b'nikush b'shat ha'nikush b'idur b'shat ha'edur. So he saw them, the people in that area, they were hoeing in the time of hoeing, and weeding in the time of weeding. I think that's what that means. In other words, they were engaged in the hard labor of agriculture. Amar, Avram said, "Halavai yehi chelki ba'aretz hazot." Right? May it be that I have a place, in my portion is in this land. Amar lo kadosh baruch hu. So God said to Avraham, "L'zarcha aten et haaretz hazot." Because you want it, I will give it to you. So, aside from this being, one of the great aliyah midrashim and all that, and kind of the concept of the perhaps in the Tzionut, right, that you had the people who came and they dealt with the swamps and they built up the land, and that's what you have to kind of put in that effort in order to inherit the land. Leaving all that aside, what seems to come out of this is a much more positive outlook on the nikush b'shat nikush, idur b'shat idur, the hard labor behind plowing and investing in the land. That is something that is viewed much more positively than the ochlim shotim pochazin, right? The lifestyle that is of opulence and extravagance, which we could associate back to perhaps like a career in business where you have וחמרא and bשרא, as the Gemara in Yevamot said. So I guess what I'm trying to kind of highlight here is that on the one hand you have these practical kind of considerations that say it's a much harder life, it's more it's more filled with stress, and that it's the lowest of the professions. But also that not despite that, but because of that, it may have merit in that it leads a person who is engaged in that to grow a greater appreciation for God and not lead such a frivolous lifestyle. And maybe also to what Johnny said about and being so connected to the land leads you to actually appreciate God in a much more visceral way than being kind of removed from it in other professions. I just want to kind of touch on, to conclude and go back to Rabbi Elazar. So how do we understand then where he says, Atidin kol baalei umaniyot she'amdu al karka? Then in the future everyone's going to want to work the land. So how do we understand that statement? So the Eitz Yosef, in his commentary, he actually looks at the idea that we've developed in terms of the more perhaps positive aspects of agriculture to explain Rabbi Elazar's statement. And he says as follows. He says, okay. ומזה תבין דבריהם שכל מה שדיברו פה מעניין הקרקע שאינה מעלה שכר הרבה. Right, from this you'll understand their words in our Gemara, because everything they said here when it comes to the land is that it doesn't eina maleh schar harbe, right? It's not a lucrative business. Dibru b'zeh rak leharot tova. So the Eitz Yosef says all these statements about how business is better than you and you don't yield any income. So the Eitz Yosef says they're making those statements to say, yeah, practically that's true, but that's actually a good thing. That's what he argues, right? V'hi umanat pchuta she'ena migbahat halev u'misira kol kin'a v'chol kavod asher hema kol shorosh po'ev rosh v'lana. And so his interpretation of that en lecha umanut pchuta min hakarka, so it's not that it's the lowest profession in terms of being the hardest and the lowest income. It means the lowest in the sense that it lowers a person. Right, that it means that a person who's engaged in agriculture is not going to be arrogant, and it means that he's not going to be jealous and he's not going to seek honor. He's going to be someone who works hard and then reaps what he sows. And all those other attributes and characteristics are negative things. So in that sense, the Eitz Yosef argues that really all of these statements that we had initially interpreted as having a more negative connotation, he says, are actually positive. And that it's specifically because it's so low that's what makes it actually a good thing. So he would it would seem, be more in line with the frame of mind of Bereshit Rabbah, and perhaps even the Tosfot and Shabbat and the Sifra that we saw earlier. In contrast, the Iyun Yaakov, with this we'll conclude, has a different way to resolve Rabbi Elazar's two statements. And he says as follows: V'amir Rabbi Elazar, Atidin kol ba'alei umaniyot she'amdu al hakarka shneimar v'yadu maniyotihem. So he says as follows. Let me zoom in here. Divrei Rabbi Elazar tmuim. He says that this is very surprising what he says. D'hai kra lo kai klal al ha'atid rak shamai ri hamikrot b'mampalat sur. So he says, right, he quotes a pasuk from Yecheskel, and he says everybody's going to leave their professions in the future and go be farmers. And he says, because in Yecheskel it says all the sailors are going to leave their boats and come be farmers. So he says, the Yaakov says, that pasuk is talking. It's not talking about the end of days. It's talking about a prophecy about the downfall of a particular kingdom. So why is Rabbi Elazar extrapolating from that to talk about the Atid Lavo? And B, further problem. right? And you can't remove psukim from the clear context that they're provided in. V'tu kasha, and another problem, kol ba'alei umanot minalan, d'haloktiv rak v'yadu manayotehem. He says, and also it just says that sailors are going to leave their boats and become farmers. So how does Rabbi Elazar understand that all professions will become farmers? So he says, v'libi omer li, Rabbi Elazar zil shitato. So he says Rabbi Elazar is consistent with his own opinion. De'amar b'Sanhedrin perik chelek daf tzadi chet amud aleph, that it says in Sanhedrin, Amar Rabbi Elazar, ein l'cha ketz megula yoter mizeh shenemar ki lifnei amim hahem schar adam lo niyev schar behema nev. Okay, it goes on and quotes this idea. Basically, what that Gemara says, that is in Sanhedrin perik chelek. It talks all about the end of days. And it has a statement there in the name of Rabbi Elazar that in the future, right, there will be an abundance. This is a famous idea. There will be an overabundance of produce, right? The land in Eretz Yisrael, in particular, the land will be extremely fertile and things will produce very easily, and there will just be this absolute overabundance of produce and of things that come from the land. And that'll be one of the blessings of the end of days. And so, based on that, Yaakov says Rabbi Elazar is the one who said that idea. So he claims, Mizeh lamad Rabbi Elazar shapir, dele'atid kevan shidbarech haaretz kol kach, yanichu kol ha'amunot shelahem, midelo yivtiach lahem gam ken beberkat scharam. So his explanation is totally different than the idea that we've developed until now. He says, why does Rabbi Elazar say that in the future everybody's going to leave their professions and become farmers? Not because farming leads a person for spiritual refinement and to become closer to God and have an appreciation of the more important things in life, and that in the future and in the days that's something that's maybe going to motivate people, and so that's what Rabbi Elazar means. No, it's not that at all. It's that in the end of days, the land is going to be so fruitful and productive that agriculture is going to become the new business. In other words, it's going to be the thing with the highest margins. It's going to be the easiest profession. Things are going to yield fruit very, very easily. And so people are going to, as they are today, just so too in the end of days, they're going to be opportunistic and go into the profession that is the most lucrative. It just happens to be that in the Atid, that's going to be agriculture, and it's not going to be what in the days of the rabbis was, perhaps commerce. So his interpretation is I think different from the Eitz Yosef, but it's kind of interesting to see how he sees that differently. And then he goes and he explains the idea of how he took it from Tzur to the future and why the sailors, as opposed to how he gets from all professions as opposed to just the sailors, but that's less important for us. So that's kind of it. When all the dust settles, we see that there's kind of this ambivalence, perhaps, not about the reality of working the land, like what that means. Nobody says that it's easy, and nobody says that it's something that you should strive for in order to have a good life, in the sense of Bשרא וחמרא. But the question is, what does that mean in terms of not your finances, but your spirituality and your moral standing? And perhaps there is room to say that agriculture, which is Seder Zoraim, it leads to Emunah, Shema'amin b'chai olamim v'zoreah, which, according to the Eitz Yosef, and some of the midrashim that we saw, is something that's admirable. Again, I think that the Gemara that we started with here in Yevamot is not that way, right? That the rabbis here are much more business-minded, business-oriented. Like Rav was going through the field and saying to the stalks, keep swaying, but in the end, I'm going to go do commerce so that I can have my wine and meat at the end of the day. So they're not dealing with this kind of idealistic spiritual lift from living a hard lifestyle, but they're saying you should. Agriculture is not the way to go. It's pchuta min hakarka, not because it lowers you and makes you humble, but because it's just the worst profession to be in. Ad kan.
Go on, Frank.
Johnny, it wasn't the part where I was going to say. You go first.
I was just going to say, I wonder if Chazal, right, that are saying that agriculture is a bad thing. I wonder if they're the quote unquote more Haredi ones, right? That throughout the Gemara and throughout Chazal kind of take an approach to more of an approach of kind of you should learn Torah the whole time, and therefore agriculture will, because we know it will take all your time, will take you away from learning Torah, as opposed to the others who see agriculture as a good thing and maybe a way of connecting you more to Baruch are the ones that, let's say, the more modern Orthodox community appreciates throughout the various quotes in the Gemara. Just wonder, I don't know if, it's a kind of hard thing to work out. Just thought it was interesting.
Very good. You're trying to put the boxes of today's world into those times. That's an interesting point. I'm sure there's lots of, sugyas about the idea of, going in, how you have to learn Torah and then how your work complements versus clashes with that requirement. And right, the only thing that comes to mind is brachot, is it memhe, right? Rabbi Shmuel says that a person should work, and Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai says a person should learn Torah all the time. And then the Gemara says lots of people tried like Rabbi Shmuel and were successful, and lots of people tried like Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai and were not successful. That the average person needs to work, and then you have certain people who can sit and learn Torah all day, right? And then you can say that seems to be the conclusion of the Gemara, and then the Haredi community today maybe has a different perspective on that. But it's a good point. Maybe it should be. I'm sure there's sugyas out there that kind of touch on that aspect of this whole discussion. But it wasn't something that I was dwelling on. Thanks for raising the idea. Efrain, did you have something or?
No, I was just going to say that I should start studying agriculture and leave computer science, because it's going to be the new high tech when Mashiach comes. That's Amen. See, they say I forget what the story was, but when I think Choni Amagia, or whatever, how do you really daven for rain? How do you really expect rain to come? You bring an umbrella that day to work because you're expecting the rain to come. That's you're showing you're so sure that the rain's gonna come, so you bring an umbrella even though it's a sunny day. So I guess for me, I want to bring Mashiach now. Slogan, so I should start studying agriculture because that will bring Mashiach. But
there's ag tech, right? There's all this tech that has to do with agriculture, which if you're going to be really modern Orthodox about the whole thing, at the Gemara we saw in the name of Rabbi Elazar in Sanhedrin, where he says, in the days of Mashiach, right? How do we know Mashiach's coming? Because suddenly the land is going to be extremely fruitful and bountiful. So again, is that there's going to be this miracle and suddenly things are just going to grow from the ground without any effort? Or does it mean that we will advance as, people will become so advanced in their technology that they'll get to a point where it just becomes really easy to create produce? And then it could be that, and then you've kind of fulfilled the.
I agree. I buy into that.
Yeah, you buy into
that. Lab-grown meat, the whole lot.
Yeah, there's a whole. You could interpret all this stuff like that, right? You have what are the curses of Adam and Chava? I love this one, right? That Adam is that you. This is actually Ephraim what you said, right? Adam's curse is that you'll only eat bread by the sweat of your brow. You have to work hard for it. And Chava's curse is that you'll be'etziv tildi banim. Right? You'll have pain in childbirth. But look at modern life. Most people get an income by sitting behind a desk all day. So they're not sweating when they work. If anything, they have an AC blowing on them. And there's epidurals, right? Childbirth isn't painful anymore. So it could be that you have kind of that more. I remember I actually had a Rebbe in YU. The economics professor was also a rabbi. That there's also another Gemara that says in Yevamot Mashiach, there won't be any coins for transactions. They won't use money to transact between different parties. And he said that's because you're going to have credit cards and Bitcoin. It's all going to be digital. Right? You're not going to have physical coins passed from one person to the other. That's like
what is Vesad etchem al kanfei nesharim. What are kanfei nesharim? Airplanes.
The airplanes, exactly. Yeah, it's that whole kind of way of interpreting these Gemaras is really, really interesting. Yeah, I like it. It's good. Yeah, for sure.
On a totally different note, whenever like you share your screen and like you have that like icon of pancakes with like marmalade on the bottom, whatever. I don't know what it is. It makes me hungry.
Okay. It's a database software, whatever.
I assume so.
All right, I'm going to stop the recording now. Shkoyach.
Yeah.